Hello everyone, and welcome to A New Perspective. A New Perspective is a series of videos and articles designed to help you gain new insights into the game that you're playing. Today, we're going to be talking about the 5 aspects of a competitive player. In other words, the 5 skills that you build up as you improve. If you enjoy this type of content, be sure to follow on Twitch and Twitter. They're both Ramses _Esports. If you want to join in on the conversation, be sure to check out the Discord, which you can find at either Twitch or Twitter. Let's get into it. I've always been a fan of dissecting games, categorizing states of the game to easily understand the individual bits while keeping overview over the whole. Of course, this is a pitfall in and of itself, because you do not want to hyper-focus on individual bits. You want to keep that overview. Today we're going to follow the dissection of the skills of a competitive player, and this is applicable in a lot of ways. One of the easiest ways to apply this is when you're doing VOD review. It is very easy to recognize which skill of yours is lacking when you know which skills there are. Additionally, I believe this is very useful in a match setting. Same logic for this. When you know what's going wrong, it's easier to do something about it. Let's get into the rundown. So first I want you to look at the left of the screen where I wrote down the 5 aspects that we were talking about. They are execution, knowledge, Yomi, valuation, and piloting. Now, I'd like you to look at the right where I've made a chart how these aspects interact with each other. So at the very top, which is where we are beginning, is the knowledge. Everything you do is based on knowledge. Out of this knowledge, you create your Yomi and valuation. And valuation draws even further from Yomi. Next, your piloting draws from both Yomi and valuation, and even forms a feedback loop with your Yomi mid-match, which in turn strengthens your valuation. And finally, if you want to execute anything, you have to do the execution check. If any of that was confusing, don't worry, I'm going to get into every aspect individually. So each of these aspects have various degrees of importance and complexity, and we're going to get into that right now. First off, execution. So execution I would describe as, can you properly translate your thoughts into the game? Luckily for us, execution is a very simple aspect. It is the simplest of the 5 skills because it is binary. That means you either succeeded it or not. On top of it, there are hardly any physical barriers in esports because it is so important and so simple. It is often the first thing you have to master. Seeing an execution error in VOD review is the worst possible thing. When doing VOD review, you spend a lot of time because you want to learn new things. You don't learn anything from making an executionary mistake. I compare it to playing chess when the pieces are glued to the board. There's no use to chess when you cannot even translate your thoughts into the game. And the same goes for fighting games. Moving on to knowledge. Knowledge, as we saw in the chart, is the basis of all your decisions. It is the source of all the other aspects. And I would describe knowledge as, do you understand every aspect of that situation? So when you're doing VOD review and you see something going wrong, did you understand every aspect of that situation? So why is the knowledge so important, right? A game is a closed system, which is a fancy way of saying it's all math. And when something is all math, it is possible to know everything about it. For fighting games though, we're gonna have to nuance it a little bit more. There's knowledge of the system, but there's also knowledge of the meta game. And that's something that you'll see in any competitive game. Knowledge of the meta game might include things like matchups, or character game plans, or strategies that are very common right now. That said, it's almost impossible to know everything. After all, I like to say every frame is a unique situation. But if every frame is a unique situation, it is impossible to learn anything about the game. And that is where you need to get better at abstracting information. That is, understanding information in such a way that you can apply it in similar situations. The strategy you use to pressure one character might carry over to other characters. And knowing where this carries over is the sign of a player that truly understands the game. In my opinion, the most important aspect about knowledge is gaining new perspectives. When you get that new perspective, you'll be able to watch VODs that you've watched 1,000 times and still get new information out of it. So that's why in my coaching, I try to help people gain those new understandings about the game. An important thing to keep in mind is that your knowledge base needs to be constantly evolving. Evolving your knowledge base means giant strides in improvement. When you watch that VOD, know what went wrong and know where your knowledge was lacking in that situation. Oh boy, let's get into Yomi. So Yomi is actually a very hard player skill to master. Yomi means reading in Japanese, and in the context of fighting games, it means reading the opponent's actions. I would describe Yomi as, do you know what your opponent wants to do? So unlike execution and knowledge, which is binary, you either know something or you don't. You either do it well or you don't. Yomi is very fluid. there's a very personal aspect to Yomi. Now, the reason why Yomi is a thing in fighting games is because fighting games are double blind. And to understand that, we first need to talk about solvability. Solvability is a concept in game theory which talks about whether you can win a game by following a flowchart, a preset amount of steps that do not change while you're playing the game. Competitive games often try to avoid being solvable by adding a lot of variables. You can see this in Go or chess. On the other hand, a game like checkers, which has less variables, has already been solved. Technically, chess and Go are also solvable, but due to the large amount of variables, it is not yet solved. Fighting games follow a similar approach. However, due to the speed of fighting games and due to the natural limitations of the human mind, they are also double blind. And double blind is basically the same thing as rock, paper, scissors. You reveal your options at the same time. This means that you cannot just observe and always react to the exact observations. You always have to make a little bit of a guess on what your opponent is going to do. And to get a more in-depth look at this, let's read the quote on the right of the screen by David Sirlin on designing Yomi, his fighting game-based card game. You might think that fighting games have perfect information because both players can see the same screen at all times and there's nothing hidden. You always know exactly which options and resources your opponent has, and they know the same about you. Fighting games are actually double blind though, because of the speed of the gameplay. At the moment when you do a move, you usually do not know what the opponent is doing exactly. Human perception is only so fast, so you're acting on information that's always a few 60ths of a second old. Fighting games are measured in frames, which are 60ths of a second. At the exact moment you jump, you do not know if the opponent threw a fireball or not, unless they threw it several frames ago. Some of your moves are made on reaction, of course, but many of your moves are essentially made in a double blind situation. So to win at these double blind interactions, you need to know what the opponent is doing, and that is Yomi. Yomi is understanding your opponent. Yomi is empathy. One thing that I think a lot of the newer players get wrong is they think Yomi is about the hard reads, about getting the read on that roll and punishing it as hard as you can, about reading the jump before it even happens. This is not the case. I need to stress this is not the case. Yomi is a constant force. Every button you press is gonna be based on some sort of Yomi in an ideal situation. An example of a Yomi situation is the triangle between blocking, attacking, and grabbing. But there are actually many more of these situations that happen during a game. Understanding your opponent enough to apply Yomi in all of these individual situations requires the knowledge to understand what the interactions between your character and your opponent's characters are. If you do not understand their game plan or their options in their entirety, they might be playing Yomi situations which you are not even aware of. An important example that I like to give is what I call indirect interactions. For example, you are both standing at the edge of your burst range, and you know your opponent is a defensive player, so they're going to go for a safe option. In this case, probably retreat in case you are going to throw out that move. In this situation, you can simply dash forward and take that stage control, and that is a one Yomi interaction without any damage on the board. That's what I call an indirect interaction. Winning these indirect interactions consistently is the key to consistent victories and what I think differentiates a lot of the great players from the good players. So let's get into valuation. Valuation is one of the less deep subjects, but it is one of the more abstract subjects. Valuation is, do you accurately assign value to your options? I think the best way to explain valuation is through examples. So a first example could be a guaranteed punish. Taking Smash as an example, someone hits your shield. You know that you can punish their move either with a grab or an up B out of shield. And while the grab might be higher guaranteed damage, your up B might lead into a better situation. Understanding which of these moves is better in which scenario is key to having good valuation. An example of excellent valuation is Mango. He often forgoes the optimal punish to put you in a scenario in which he can get an even better punish, and uses his Yomi reads to have confidence in those options. So rather than going for that 60% damage combo, he might do a 20% damage combo, but if you mess up once, he will take your stock for it. And one of the examples that comes forward a lot at high level play is focus. Where do you put your focus? An example that you can see very frequently is when the opponent is at the ledge. Do you focus on the jump to anti-air more consistently? Or do you focus on the roll so they can get a harder punish on it? So that too is valuation. Which do you value more? And that is based on your Yomi, on the read that you have on the opponent. To sum it up, valuation is strategic thinking, which is also a game theory term. It is about thinking into the future, and that is what makes it so abstract. You are understanding the things that have not happened. And as such, when doing VOD review, valuation is a very hard aspect to pin down. You have to consider the option you took, but also the options you didn't take, and know enough about the situation to know if it was better to do something else. Finally, there's piloting. And the quote on the right in this scenario, we're not going to read. If you do want to read it, I suggest you pause and read through it, perhaps at the end of my talk about piloting, because I do believe it is an amazing quote that reflects back on this perfectly. So piloting is how well do you leverage your skills. If we look back at the graph in the beginning, yes, everything goes through the execution phase, but everything also goes through the piloting phase. As such, piloting is extremely important. You might be wondering, what is piloting? Well, if you've ever heard about autopiloting, you probably know what I'm talking about. There are two types of pilot that every human has: the autopilot and the deliberate pilot. Another way of saying this is thinking in System 1 or System 2. So the TLDR is System 1 is fast but inaccurate, while System 2 is slow but can solve complicated situations. Now, your goal with this is to do as much as possible with your System 1. The more you can autopilot, the better. I believe that System 1 should be your basis and System 2 should only come in when necessary. A lot of players on social media mention that you should autopilot in your first round and then rely purely on your System 2 when you're playing against stronger opponents. I do not believe this is the case. I think System 2 is way too costly even versus a good player, but I'll get into that later. So System 2 focuses on individual aspects. However, this severely slows down your gameplay and diminishes your flexibility. This is where we get into the concept of flow. Flow is a state in which your perceived challenge is equal to your perceived skill. In a state of flow, you will be able to very quickly recognize situations and find good answers to them. In other words, flow is the ideal state to be in when you're competing. So attaining flow is a goal. The way this works with your System 1 and your System 2 thinking is the challenge aspect of flow. If something is too challenging, you will use your System 2, which breaks up your flow. On the other hand, if something is too easy, you only need your System 1, which does not engage you enough to reach flow. This is why flow is a balance between the two. You handle a lot of the aspects with your System 1 and only use your System 2 where it's necessary. However, when you want to leave everything to your System 1, you're gonna need a lot of knowledge. That is because if you learn something new during the game, your System 2 is gonna handle it. And that is not what we want. The new information that we want System 2 to handle is the opponent, the human sitting in front of you. When you reach a point where you can handle all of the non-Yomi aspects with your System 1 and only need System 2 to change up your Yomi, that is the point that you want to reach. In other words, System 1 is a flowchart. However, when your flowchart fails, you need System 2 to make it follow a different part of the flowchart. However, both of these systems have flaws. And the System 1 flaw is when you're lacking in information. If you've ever played a game and you do not really understand why you're losing, why you're getting hit, that is the lack of knowledge in your System 1, and that is System 2 not being able to pick it up and rectify the issue. System 2 fails when your other 4 aspects are not developed correctly, while System 2 can solve these complex situations. If your base for solving these situations is wrong, it's gonna fail. Additionally, System 2 can fail due to what is called ego depletion. Using System 2 takes a lot of energy, and throughout the day, you cannot keep it up in every set. As such, it's very important to train your System 1 to be strong enough to win those early rounds without having to use your System 2. When your System 1 is strong enough to beat someone else's System 1 and 2, that is when you are in a good spot. Finally, piloting suffers from some personal stuff, like nervousness or fear. You need a sports psychologist and a whole nother article to get into all the various variations and personal issues that might come up in a tournament setting. However, it might be nice to keep this in mind when reflecting. So, thanks for sticking with me to the end. I hope you liked the first episode of A New Perspective. I've covered a lot of concepts here, but I do believe understanding this at a basic level can help you reflect a lot more efficiently and get a lot more information out of VODs. Unfortunately, I cannot go in depth on every aspect, but if you do like this content, be sure to follow on Twitch, Twitter, or even join the Discord. I will always post on both Discord and Twitter when new content goes live, so be sure to check that out. If you want to ask me any questions or just engage in the conversation, the best way to do so is Discord, which is also accessible in the description. For now, that was all. Stay smart.